Hey everyone, I was just grooving to our super 80s music there. Welcome to the Six Bridges Literary Festival, coming to you from Little Rock, Arkansas. My name is Dorian Stuber, and I am a member of the talent committee of the festival, and I also teach at Hendrix College in nearby Conway, Arkansas. It's really my pleasure today to be moderating this panel with historians Wendy Lauer and Jonathan Petropoulos. I'm going to briefly introduce them now, and then each will present the gist of their books for us, and that will lead us into a conversation. And then we're also looking forward to taking your questions, which you can pose at any time using the chat function here on Zoom, and I'll be keeping an eye on that as we move through the hour. So that's how we're going to proceed. Okay, so our two panelists today. I'll start by introducing Wendy Lauer. Wendy Lauer is professor of history at Claremont McKenna College and the director of the Magrublian Center for Human Rights. In addition to the Ravine, which is the book she'll be talking to us about today primarily, she is the author of several other works, including Hitler's Furies, German Women in the Nazi Killing Fields, which was a finalist for the National Book Award. And my favorite of her books, which is maybe a little lesser known, but I wanted to just kind of like give that some props, is the diary of Samuel Goldfarb in the Holocaust in Galicia, which is a really remarkable document written by a Jew in hiding in southeastern Poland in early 1943. And her annotations and her descriptions of what befell that manuscript after Goldfarb's death are a real tour de force, and I recommend it to you all. Our other second panelist, Jonathan Petropoulos, is also professor of history at Claremont McKenna. And in addition to this book, Goering's Man in Paris, which will be the focus of his comments today, he has numerous publications, which include The Faustian Bargain, The Art World in Nazi Germany, and Artists Under Hitler, Collaboration and Survival in Nazi Germany. From 1999 to 2000, he was the research director for the Presidential Advisory Commission on Holocaust Assets in the United States. And he's acted as expert witness in lots of restitution cases, which comes up in the book that he's talking about today. So I think that we decided beforehand that, well, first of all, welcome both of you. So delighted you could be here. I think we decided beforehand, Jonathan, you would start. So I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you, Dorian. I am going to share screen. So I'll show a few images to go along with my overview of the book. Slideshow from current slide. There we are, yes. So here's my latest book. It came out earlier this year in January from Yale University Press. There's actually a little bit of a story about the cover, but we can come back and talk to that, maybe talk about that in the Q&A. Goering's Man in Paris is this gentleman, Dr. Bruno Lohse, an art historian, and as you can see on the left, a member of the SS, and he lived to the ripe old age of 96. I met him in 1998, and so I interviewed him over a 9-year period. I interviewed him approximately 30 to 40 times in those 9 years. And I think this book is very much what Wendy and I have been calling the personal turn in history. And that's when the author writes him or herself into the story. And so I do that with this book, not initially, which is about Lohse himself, but by the time we get to 1998 and what he's doing, at that point, then I become a character in the book as well. Personal turn can mean other thing about personal sources and what have you. And again, we can talk about that. This is a book I could only write at this stage of my life and my career. I've been working on the subject of Nazi looted art for over 35 years. My first book, my dissertation, was about the Nazi leaders' art collections. The second one that Dorian mentioned, Faustian Bargain, about the experts who facilitated the collecting for the Nazi leaders. And the third is about artists and cultural producers in the Third Reich. And the book that really prepared the way, I think, most for Goering's Man is Faustian Bargain. And in this book, it was interesting. I wrote about different professions who helped the Nazis collect the art. This was an art historian named Kajetan Mühlmann, probably the most prolific, the greatest plunderer in all of history, because he stole in Vienna, in Poland, and the Netherlands. But in Faustian Bargain, no chapter has more than 30 pages for the figure. And I think this is oftentimes a metaphor for what I do, is I have a picture of these individuals, but there's so many pieces that are missing, right? And in Mühlmann's case, again, I just didn't know that much. Everything I had, I put in the book, but it was limited. So Goering's Man in Paris is different in that it's the first up close and personal treatment of a Nazi art plunder, I believe. The methodology I developed in Faustian Bargain proved really important for Goering's Man, because I went out there and I started interviewing the surviving members, right? At first, I was in cemeteries trying to figure out when people died and what happened to them, my Nazi hunting dog. I found Mühlmann's grave here, by the way. He died in 1958. That led me to his widow, who lived in the Austrian Alps, and she shut the door just as I took this photo, but she let me go into the attic above that house there, and I found photos of Mühlmann in the 1950s, and I figured out what he had done when he was a wanted man on the run in the 1950s. You know, talking to Mühlmann's widow led me to this gentleman, Wilhelm Hüttel, who was an SS general who worked with Adolf Eichmann in Budapest, persecuting Hungarian Jews. And Hüttel led me to Bruno Lohse, right, Goering's Man. And so this was something I did that I had never done in my work before, was to interview the subjects in this way. Just very briefly, Lohse was an art historian, a PhD in art history. His academic work was not so distinguished that an academic career opened for him. So he became an art dealer, but a completely unimportant one in the late 1930s. He was also, as I mentioned, a member of the SS. In 1941, when he was stationed in Poland, he had an opportunity to go to Paris and become one of Hermann Goering's, the #2 man of the Third Reich, his art agents there. And Bruno Lohse jumped at the opportunity and spent the rest of the war in Paris. When Lohse died in 2007, I inherited his photographs. And so I have hundreds of these images that helped me paint this portrait, this vivid portrait of what it was like, you know, as he was showing Goering artworks. They were at banquets, right? You know, all the privation of the war, but the plunderers in Paris lived like kings. He had girlfriends and mistresses, and we talk about that in the book. And he had a chance to enrich himself and to embezzle. They look at these two paintings by Matisse and they laugh, but the modern works that the Nazis called degenerate were sequestered, and this gave Lohse an opportunity to pilfer, to embezzle, to make trades, and I think that was a source of his post-war wealth, right? So one goal of the book is just a really vivid portrait of what it's like to be a Nazi art plunderer in that way. The second part of the book, I think the real contribution is what happens to these Nazi art plunderers after the war. Lohse was put on trial in Paris in 1950. He was acquitted, surprisingly, amazingly. He rehabilitated, revived his career, he called himself an art historian, but he was an art dealer. He lived in the top floor of this apartment building in Munich, fairly modest considering his resources. But just to give a glimpse of what he did in the post-war period, as soon as he got out of prison in 1950, he came to New York and saw this gentleman who had been an OSS officer, a monuments man, Ted Rousseau, now a curator at the Met. Their correspondence was declassified while I was researching this book, and there are hundreds of letters where Rousseau is writing to Lohse and seeing Lohse on his annual trips to Europe to buy art. Lohse is writing to Rousseau and coming to the Met, just dropping by the Met to see his friend Rousseau, right? So this is a chapter we haven't really written about, these monuments officers who occupied such important positions in the museum world, dealing with these old Nazi dealers, right? And the monuments officers, they knew exactly about Nazi looted art. This was not a secret. This is the front page of the New York Times in 1964, but they wanted the art, and Lohse knew where the art was and could source it for them, right? He was a very impressive figure as he revived his career in the 60s and 70s. He also trafficked in looted art. He had a bank vault in Zurich. There's a long saga, a whole chapter devoted to this Fischer Pissarro, Camille Pissarro, a French Jewish impressionist, and we found it in the Zurich Cantonal Bank and got it restituted through an aide, a partner of Lohse's. The journey took me to Liechtenstein, where Lohse had a foundation that concealed his assets. So it's all about Switzerland, and Liechtenstein is part of this whole system of art trading, right? And finally in the book, it's about Lohse's relationship with the Wildensteins, arguably the most important art dealers in the second half of the 20th century. And Lohse had helped process their plundered art during the war. They were French Jews who had their art stolen, yet they worked with them, they employed him. The Wildensteins are the stuff of scandal about expensive divorces and plastic surgery gone wrong, but they are fabulously wealthy with billions of dollars in art, and Lohse was in their orbit. You know, Lohse's lawyer, Frederick Schöne, was the Wildenstein's lawyer, and Schöne was importing industrial quantities of art for the Wildensteins to the United States starting in the 1950s. So we have this link between Lohse, Schöne, and the Wildensteins that the Wildensteins themselves have admitted in this way. We know that Lohse has sold works to museums, including these two so-called Kaiser pictures that went to the German Historical Museum, but he usually used an intermediary, a cutout. So it's very difficult to track Lohse, but we've done our best. He took a lot of secrets to the grave, but we're trying to unearth them. So that's my initial overview. Thank you.
Yeah, admirably lucid and
and quick, and really quick here. Yes,
it's almost as if you've done it before. Yeah, so that was great. Thank you. It's a really wonderfully succinct digest of the book. That's so great. Wendy, you're gonna share a similar condensed version, I gather.
Yes, yeah. I don't know how smooth and tight knit it's going to be. That was pretty well done there, Jonathan, as far as getting the gist of your book. So thank you, and I will also stick to my time limit so we have more time for questions. My book is quite a bit is different in that it really focuses on one photograph, but in some ways it's kind of a biography. It's a biography of a photograph and the life of a photograph and the agency of that photograph. Some of this was inspired by the fact that I had seen a lot of photography used in a very public way, like at the museum, Holocaust Museum in Washington, D.C., or at Yad Vashem, and also in my teaching, how much I've used photography from the Holocaust, and started to think about to what extent it could teach us new, bring out more information about what happened to the Jews of Europe, and specifically, in my case, the Jews in Ukraine, who are very much understudied. This is a story about what we are referring to today as the Holocaust by bullets. So the story of what occurred outside the camp system. And again, my interest in Ukraine, largely because 1 out of 4 victims of the Holocaust actually resided in what is the territory of Ukraine today. And a lot of people don't realize just how devastated that population was and its historical significance as well in the 20th century. It tends to be overshadowed by Poland and by Germany. So I wanted to draw attention to that in the same way that I did in the diary that you mentioned as well, Dorian. So thank you for showing that. So we all know how a single photograph can be of suffering, can propel humanitarian action and social justice. Think about the image of the little girl fleeing the napalm attack in Vietnam, or the little boy who washed up on the beach in Bodrum, Alan Kurdi, and what that did as far as the refugee policy in Europe, right? So these photographs, atrocity photographs, depictions of extreme suffering, some of them rather, graphic, sometimes even pornographic, they're in the public domain. And the challenge is, what are we going to do with them, and how are we going to teach with them, and how are we going to learn from them? And I pose the question, what kinds of research can be done on them? So the book is also about different methods of research and what institutions we can draw from in order to kind of solve the mysteries that are inherent in these kinds of photographs. So I just want to show the photograph that is the feature of the central image of my book, and warn you that it's rather obviously very compelling and also rather disturbing too. So here is, can you see that?
Mm-hmm.
Let's see. Is that coming up?
Yep.
Okay, good. This is a photograph, and it was brought to my attention in 2009 when I was at the Holocaust Museum working in the archives. I wasn't actually working on anything related to this. I just happened to be there. And again, there's a lot of themes that are kind of woven into the book. One is the community of scholars that work in this field and all the different disciplines that are applied to this kind of research. And the serendipity of a lot of this research and the collaboration in the best sense of scholars. So I'm at the museum in DC, and these journalists walk in from Prague. They kind of have this, go on this pilgrimage, they go on this journey to the museum to bring this artifact, to bring this powerful photograph to find out more. And because this picture was taken in Ukraine, I was sitting there, I was working on something else, and my colleague basically tapped me on the shoulder and said, I think you want to take a look at this. We have this image from a town called Mariupol, Ukraine, a kind of shtetl, a small community about 100 miles west of Kiev, in the heartland of the Russian Empire, of the Jewish Pale of Settlement. So it's a town that is historically significant, and I'm going to show you some images from the town in a moment. But what's really striking about this image, it was taken October 13th, 1941 in this town in Ukraine, was the very clear depiction here of collaboration. That's the first thing that I focused on. These Ukrainians are standing here with these German officials. You can see the markings of their uniforms, the Germans, the Nazis, and they're really shoulder to shoulder, the kind of proximity to the victims, the intimacy of this killing, and yet these killers don't share the same language or same culture. These Germans have just kind of rolled in during the Nazi occupation and invasion of the Soviet Union in the summer of 1941, called Operation Barbarossa. And this is when the mass murder in mass shootings really starts in the summer of 41. So here we have a stark depiction of collaboration. It's an action shot. You can see the grimace, the expressions of the shooters, the smoke, there's motion there. This, I would learn later from ballistics experts, is further evidence that this was in fact a mass shooting, because this kind of haloing, this hovering of the smoke, and then the blast coming through the muzzle that penetrates that is what happens when you have, victims prior to this poor family at the center of the photo. And the fact that we have an empty coat on the bottom here and these shoes, maybe some papers there, also indicates that there were prior victims. And even more conclusive would be down below the shoes here, we can see kind of the litter of mass murder, and those are the bullet casings that are there from the prior victims. And as I started to work on the photo, I decided to kind of pick it apart, the various elements of the photo. The shoes in the foreground, and we're going to go back to those being an important symbol of loss, of the absence of presence, or the presence of absence, and what we don't know about the Holocaust or about that victim. The fact that this is happening in broad daylight, we can see the light passing through these trees, and this is what we know of the Holocaust by bullets, that it transpired in the outskirts of all these small towns. And that means you have witnesses, you have those I spoke to who heard what was happening, who could smell and could and could see what was happening, and that's part of their local memory and that local history. That the Nazis put nature to work, that there's an important story here as far as environmental history, which is another field which has been really taking off. And how do they do that when they use ravines, when they use rivers, when they use the soil to suffocate the victims? That there is a method of genocide, there's a method of killing that incorporates the local terrain down to what the landscape is, what the topography is. And that they leave that there's going to be that will remain, that can't be completely covered up. And so when I go back to this crime scene, as I'll show you in a moment, we do discover things at that actual scene. And here we see the collaborators, as I mentioned, they're standing so close to one another. There's an onlooker there with that cap, he's somehow assisting. There's a division of labor that's part of this killing process. It's systematic, it's organized. And here, again, at the center, the family. And that is a chapter in the book where I explore the theme of family in the Nazi genocide. The fact that Hitler said in the summer of 1941 that he did not want one family to remain on the continent of Europe. This is what genocide scholars refer to as root and branch. So, you know, the genociders thinking that these victims, the survivors, will come back and avenge their loved ones, and that this cycle will continue, and the Nazis were going to pursue this once and for all, hence final solution, by aiming to actually obliterate entire families, root and branch, and leave no traces, or leave no one left to vouch for them, to testify them. And that other chapter is about kind of the missing. What happens when genociders kind of succeed in destroying communities, to the extent that there are no surviving family members to even register someone as missing, and how do you find those victims? I wanted to, you know, restore as much as I could the faces and identities of these victims. This is not how they want to be portrayed. This is one of the ethical dilemmas in working in this kind of atrocity photography, not kind of showing the image in a way that would create yet another assault on their dignity, on their lives. This is not how they want to be portrayed. And lastly, the photographer. So that was probably the biggest surprise in the book. Given the stability of this photo, the composition of it, clearly this is someone who's taking it up close, and the others aren't noticing him. So he seems to be there officially, and indeed the photographer was there, and he was there in uniform. And so these victims, you know, assumed that he was a collaborator, that he could take such a picture so closely. But here is the testimony that the journalists brought with them when they came from Prague, of the photographer. It's in Slovakian. This was very much, again, I had to draw on a lot of resources among my colleagues. This is European history. This is international history. I don't have Slovakian. I have some rudimentary Ukrainian and Russian, and I'm comfortable in German. A lot of the records were also in Yiddish and Hebrew, and this is obviously in Slovakian. So it, you know, it was something that I had to rely on my colleagues to actually undertake this and complete this work. So they helped me translate these testimonies. This is the photographer was actually interrogated 3 times for taking these pictures, and they were rough interrogations. They started during the war in 1943. He was interrogated because those pictures that he took, the one that I feature in my book, are incriminating to those killers we see in the image. But the Nazis, including Himmler himself, issued multiple orders to collect these images and suppress them, because they knew that they were going to be, as they put it, material for the resistance. And it turns out that, in fact, the photographer, and he took 5 pictures that day. His camera that model camera, as I researched the actual camera as well, he could have taken 8 images. So I found 5 of the 8. And it is his visual kind of narrative, his visual testimony of what happened. And it's actually done to resist the genocide. And after he takes these pictures, here's our photographer and here's his camera. He pretends to be ill. He goes home. He doesn't go back to the front. He's writing letters to his wife before that saying, this is horrific. This is not the war I signed up for. His brain is turning black, his hair is turning gray, and he uses these images to warn the Jews in Bratislava and his hometown of Banska Bystrica to not respond to the call for these deportations. The first Jews who were deported to Auschwitz-Birkenau actually were deported from Slovakia in March 42. So they were among the first victims of the gassings there. And so he's informing the local Jewish community. There he is during the war. This was taken in Mirapol in a photo studio about a month before he took that atrocity image. He's in the center of this photograph. He was the company's scribe of his unit, so he was allowed to have that camera. So he's warning the Jews, and he ends up hiding family in his attic and bringing Jews to what he's hoping are safe spots in the forest near his hometown, and engage in these kinds of resistance efforts. Another theme in the book is just about the power of photography and the proliferation of the handheld camera. and why we have the most documented, visually documented genocide with the Holocaust, and questioning again what we do with these photographs and how this impacted ordinary people, the circulation of these images as part of the history and part of our public memory. Mariupol, as I mentioned, is a small town west of Ukraine, of Kiev. I visited there a couple times. This is 2014, but I just pause at this image because it's, first of all, it was taken at the very location where the Jews were gathered, the Jews in that image, the photograph, before they were gunned down at the edge of their town. And the population of Jews was, this was not historically the kind of civilization that existed prior to the Holocaust, and how the destruction of that community created these vacancies, created even socioeconomically just depleted this town with its kind of livelihood, that there was a system there of a way of life that was working for centuries. And this is really kind of the outcome, the aftermath of genocide, and also for Ukraine. This is the struggles they have in the post-Soviet era, and a country still at war with Russia. And these are some images just showing you how the Jews were forced to be marched. Here's the center of town there. And then these are drawings from the Soviet trial. So the photograph is sitting in this Prague archive and doesn't really see the light of day until 2009. So it could not be used for these cases in Ukraine or in Germany to go after those killers. And remarkably, one of the last trials in Soviet Ukraine is this case in 1987 against those Ukrainians who are in the image. And here's the investigative file there. And there is success in that pursuit of justice. Actually, the Ukrainians are, as you can see here, apprehended, and they're actually convicted. And one of the killers was a youth at the time of the war, so he got 15 years sentence. The other, they were executed in January 1987. So Ukraine gets its independence in 1991, and I'm starting to travel to Ukraine in the summer of '92, and it just, this person, one of those killers, could have been alive, but when I went back to Mariupol, nobody had heard from him again. The West German story of justice is not as kind of satisfying. One of the German killers was denounced by a former comrade in 1969. And this is a police report from West Germany. Actually, it was just striking in this document because it's a regular kind of template, a regular form that any police official who's at that station on duty would pull out. And yet it's reporting a murder from 1941. And it turns out that those killers were not even like SS police, but were customs guards. So that wasn't even, that was an all volunteer killing squad that I showed you in that image. My last challenge was to find the victims, and that proved to be the most difficult. And I got close, but I could not with any certainty, 100% certainty, identify them. I had to work with a few lists of the Jewish community. Here's one that was drawn up right when the Red Army returned, the Soviets returned, and just kind of look at family clusters and birth dates to see if there was a little boy that might have been the boy in the photo. And I did find a family. This is at Yad Vashem, and I think you'll agree with me that it's pretty remarkable because there is a likeness here. This does look like the woman who's bending over. There's another child on her lap, and then this little boy. This is what's left of this family, the Vasilyuk family. They took this picture, just the women and children left in this extended family. This is when the ghetto existed in this town. And I published this photograph because, first of all, they're another victimized family that we didn't know about, that's on record, but also because they're posing in the way that they want to be remembered, not in the way that the photograph, the atrocity photograph, depicts those victims. We showed this image to local inhabitants in Mirapol. I conducted research there with an organization called Yahad and Unum, a French priest who's been very active in Ukraine uncovering mass graves, and learned more about what this one woman here, she moved into a Jewish home and saw the massacre from her bedroom window, and described that to us as well. And what this means for those local inhabitants, those Ukrainians, mostly peasants. One woman who actually was forced to dig the pit where those Jews were shot that day, who recounted that moment when she was at that site. She had to actually hang around because the officials, the shooters, the killers, needed to be fed and work needed to be done around that site. So that was her labor assignment. It was incredibly gruesome. So that memory was very vivid for her. So here we retrace the steps to that killing site and discover that it's not protected at all, and that the terrain was still very disrupted and visibly there were very little signs of kind of natural erosion there. The vegetation was really skewed, and there was a lot of mounds, looked like kind of craters and mounds like the moon. And we actually found bones. We just moved the soil from the surface and the leaves, and there were bones there. And that's because of that investigation. That Soviet investigation was late, and it was pretty invasive, their attempt to find the remains of the victims, and they used heavy equipment. And that was yet another assault on those souls at that grave site, which is still not protected. So I have maybe a minute or not.
Do it.
I guess we were going to read, I probably have 1 minute, a little bit from our books to give the audience just a sense of a little the flavor of our narrative and the tone of our narrative. So I just have a few things I want to just read and wrap up about these empty shoes and the crumpled coat that exist in the image as questions and gaps in our knowledge that remind us of the victims whom we cannot see and the many who were murdered and remained missing. Prior to and during the Holocaust, empty shoes figured in abstract art, literature, and photography as symbols of humanity, and the use of shoes to depict loss is not only a post-war curatorial technique of Holocaust museums. We already see during the war the Yiddish poet Abraham Sutzkever, who wrote a poem in 1943 in Vilna Ghetto called A Load of Shoes, when he discovered his deported mother's shoes that were returned to the Vilna Ghetto, and he was in a unit that was sorting through the victims' remains back in the ghetto. And as he wrote in his poem, the feet from these boots with buttons outside, or these with no body, or these with no bride. Where is the child who fit in these? Is the maiden barefoot who bought these? Slippers and pumps, look there at my mother's, her Sabbath pair, in with the others. In Sutzkever's poem, empty shoes, slippers, and pumps exist somewhere between the living and the dead, among the children, maidens, and brides at a wedding or observing Sabbath. His shoes dance and patter. They stimulate our ability to imagine the past and provide poetic testimony to the lives of the wearers, unlike those haunting but inert objects we see today, enshrined behind glass in Birkenau or bronze as a memorial alongside the Danube River in Budapest. Atrocity images, especially the rare ones that attest to the act of genocide, the crime of all crimes, offend and shame us. When we turn away from them, we promote ignorance. When we display them in museums without captions and download them from the internet with no historical context, we denigrate the victims. And when we stop researching them, we cease to care about historical justice, the threat of genocide, and the murdered missing. Thank you.
Thanks, Wendy. Really moving and helpful overview of the scope of your work. Jonathan, did you want to read something briefly, or shall we sort of segue into the conversation? What's your...
We can segue into the conversation.
Okay. Well, again, I want to invite everyone to send in the questions, any questions they have in the chat function. But I did want to start off with a question for both of you, and it's about the metaphor of a historian as detective. and what each of you make of that metaphor. And this is, you know, a lot of the things I want to ask you guys, you touched upon in your remarks, and I don't know whether to be encouraged by this simpatico thinking or discouraged. Already said all this stuff, but Jonathan, you mentioned this personal turn, right? And so I'm thinking about that as a common element in your works, where like you each become personally involved, you meet people involved, you go to locations, etc. So, you know, what do you think of the idea of the historian as detective solving the mysteries of its past, especially its crimes? Do you accept this metaphor, reject it? Do you have a different metaphor that maybe resonates more strongly or accurately for you?
When do you want me to go first?
Yeah.
So I accept the metaphor of historian as detective, and I think it's very much what we do. One of the things that we do in my earlier work, I was sometimes the historian as prosecutor. When I wrote the first draft of Faustian Bargain and sent it to my editor, he said, this is really interesting, but it reads like a prosecutorial brief. Can you write with more empathy? Can you write with more understanding of your subject and put yourself in his or her shoes? And so that was a moment for me to grow and evolve as a scholar. And so I try not to write as a prosecutor, but certainly in the case of Bruno Loza, there was detective work. One, because he was trying to obfuscate, he was trying to conceal. His friend and business partner, Peter Griebert, who was present for all our meetings, once told me the only time Loza kept receipts or even made receipts was when he wanted to deceive, right? The rest of the time it was handshake deals. It was done on matters of trust in networks that there was, you know, a code of omerta there. And so it was really difficult to break into his world and find out what he did in the post-war period. Again, for the first half of his career during the war, we have a pretty good idea of their sources, but the second half was so difficult. And also because he was still engaged in criminal activities. When he died in 2007, Loza had 40 pictures in his possession, works by Monet, Renoir, Sisley, and others. He had tens, if not hundreds of millions of dollars in art. Some of the artworks are looted, right? So this is, you know, and should be restituted, like the Fisher Pissarro. So I definitely felt there was an element of police work, detective work. And for what it's worth, I was sometimes sending reports to the FBI, to the Department of Justice, to Interpol. I was sending reports to auction houses who were doing restitution research. I saw myself as kind of on a mission for those of us in the restitution field, and, you know, maybe a team of detectives I was working with, and I would share information with other colleagues. So yes, absolutely, it's a very appropriate phrase, historian as detective. Yeah, thanks.
Yeah, I think that book by Robin Winks. I'm trying to remember who actually wrote that book, used that title, which I actually looked at when I was kind of preparing this manuscript and working on this. I wanted to see how it was applied in the past, because I think what's interesting when you work in the history of Nazi Germany, and specifically the Holocaust, or genocide studies more broadly, you are talking about the crimes of a regime, one of the most criminal regimes. It's like the history is inherently about crimes. And so you can be the historian as detective, which is applied before when it really wasn't about specifically about the history of crimes, but it was about uncovering the past and thinking about clues and even the language that was used, like interrogating your sources. So this was all kind of part of the language of our empirical, really largely the empirical side of what we do, and piecing together the past as kind of detective work. But in our case, it's so specifically about the past as crimes, as a catalog of crimes or criminals, that and we use all these trial records too. So it's like we're trying to solve a crime and we're relying on records that are, you know, penned by prosecutors and are you know, these trial indictments and so forth. So there's a lot that goes into the work that crosses over into kind of the legalese and even the language of Holocaust history, whereas, you know, subjects of the past are put into the categories of victim, perpetrator, bystander. and that raises all kinds of conceptual challenges because, of course, people don't self-identify in that way as subjects of the past. Bruno Loza probably would not call himself a perpetrator. So yeah, it's an interesting theme to kind of chew on.
Is there like a personal element of it too, beyond the legal one for you guys, like a thrill of the chase, like and especially with this kind of like the charged material, as you just talked about, like the sense of like, I got you now, or I figured this out, like does that enter into it as well?
Absolutely. In my case, I mean, it became a kind of competition with Bruno Loza. We play this cat and mouse game, and I knew he was lying to me sometimes. I knew there were things he was not telling me, but I was still going to get to the truth if I could. With the Fisher Pissarro, that was very much the case. I asked him about it every visit from 2000 to 2006, and he would call it the damn Pissarro picture. Are you going to ask me about Das verdammte Pissarro build? And so trying to get it out of him that he had something to do with this picture, it was definitely very, very personal. And just to say, whenever I would meet Loza, I was on sabbatical in Munich in 2000, 2001, and I'd see him about every 2-3 weeks. I'd go by. You wake up in the morning and there was an adrenaline rush. I mean, you knew you were going to do something special that day. And when you went into the room with him, he had a physical aura, a presence. He was 6'4". He weighed over 350 pounds, absolutely massive, these huge hands. And one of the things I found just after he died, I never had an opportunity to ask him about, was a letter from 1951 from a German officer, an aristocratic officer, who reported having seen Loza in Paris during the war. And according to this German officer, Loza had boasted of killing Jews with his own hands. And remembering Loza's massive hands, I could well imagine it. But in the wake of that, it became a kind of cause for me to really find out what Loza had done. Had he actually physically killed Jews himself? And so there was an urgency. There was something more than just your normal run-of-the-mill historical research going on here.
Yeah, I think too. I didn't interview. I had the opportunity to interview a high-ranking perpetrator for a period of time, but certainly not as extensively and as prolonged as what Jonathan experienced with Bruno Loza. But there were discussions at the time about, do you undertake that kind of relationship? Aren't you going to be tainted? And it was be kind of offensive to some people if you sat down and had conversations with these people. But I think as historians, to go back to the non-prosecutorial, as historians, not detectives, I found it to be incredibly valuable. First of all, there were stories and things that were shared that were not committed to paper. So I knew I was getting new information that I would then have to corroborate, but it was filling in gaps. It provided insight into the whole kind of way, the mannerisms, the language of the time, the gestures, the jokes, what was probably discussed at the water cooler, these kinds of things that were or things that were swept under the rug. Even anti-Semitic discourse, if they were very blunt with you, things like that would really resonate, because of course the Nazis documented a lot, not everything, but of course the bureaucratic way of documentation doesn't provide that kind of, the personalities aren't that stark, the undercurrents, the kinds of, it's just not as apparent. You really need to kind of interact with that person to get a taste of what's going on. And that helps you understand how these things could happen and the psychology of perpetrators and their motivations.
Yeah.
Yeah, I was criticized in one article for talking to Loza as often as I did, and someone said
Mhm.
it's one thing to go interview an old Nazi once, but why are you going back? And just for the reasons that Wendy pointed out, I thought it was crucial in order to get to the truth, but also to understand Loza, right? And just exactly as Wendy said, you got a sense of his worldview, his sense of humor. You know, he'd say utter a line. One I remember was, "I'm against all form of corruption except those I'm involved with," right? You know, and that was his Berliner sense of humor that was a little
Mm.
dark and ironic and so I thought it was absolutely crucial to see him, but you know, it was fraught, and again, as Wendy said, in our field, or you know, some people who would question going back and talking to an old Nazi like this, right?
But you both certainly make an effort to kind of like be self-reflexive about that in your text too, about your own you know, involvement in the detection process. So I have at least one more question I want to ask each of you individually, and I want to take some audience questions, and then we'll see where we're at. But so Wendy, and you, Jonathan, too. I know that you guys are both huge fans of the great Holocaust historian Raoul Hilberg. You both cite him in the books, rightly so. And reading your book, I was reminded of that scene in Claude Lanzmann's film Shoah, where Hilberg and Lanzmann are working together, and they're doing their own little detective piece of work. And Hilberg says something about like, I was always scared to ask big questions because I was, you know, I didn't worry about that because then I was scared I'd give a small answer. So I asked a lot of small questions so that I would get maybe big answers that way, right? Something I'm kind of paraphrasing, but and I really love the way you cover so much ground in this book. I mean, I would really recommend it to people as an introduction to the Holocaust. Even like it's like 200 pages, and yet it covers so much. And I think one of the reasons you can do that is because of the way you start from something really tangible with this photograph, and that sort of imminent, the close reading that you do of the photo then kind of like leads to a lot of other things, many of which you kind of touched on briefly. And so, like, for example, the nature of collaboration, the role of gendered and familial experiences of both victims and perpetrators, the ecological, environmental aspects of genocide. So I guess I just wanted to invite you to like choose one of those things or another thing that I didn't mention that also is important to you in the book, and just expand upon that a little bit for the audience, because there really are there's so many places that this investigation of the photograph goes, you know.
Well, yeah, I'm so glad you highlighted that. Again, yeah, these different elements of the photograph that and the methods that we can draw out from them and apply, as you mentioned, forensic work, environmental history, perpetrator research, victim genealogical inquiries to find the victims, the visual, just the use of the photo as such, the camera as material culture, just knowing what the object is provides more clues as far as, you know, how close was he standing to the massacre site? It didn't have a zoom lens, and how many pictures could he take, and what did we find? And that turns into a narrative. One facet of that I think is helpful, especially for educators, because you know, these photos have to be handled with care. I wouldn't argue that they should be suppressed, not at all. That's obviously counter to my entire book project. But they are tricky to present in a classroom setting, especially younger students. And I think that one angle on this is that these images of murder, of these atrocities, whether they're lynching photos or other photographs that we know of from other genocides, or even from war, you know, mass atrocity, they're inherently objects of resistance. And I just was been thinking about that more and more, because even if the genocide era takes these photographs as a moment of triumph, like that picture of the little boy from the Warsaw Ghetto with his arms raised, that is the image that is the go-to image of Jewish armed resistance during the Holocaust. And it was taken by a perpetrator in a celebratory, triumphant mode and put into a photo album that was presented to Himmler. But that same photograph was used to prosecute one of the killers in the image, Bloshka, it has also been used in a book where we try to identify who that little boy is, and Jewish survivors are like relating to that boy's experience. So they always have the power, no matter what their context of their taking is, and our photographer turned out to be in the resistance, they do inherently have the power of resistance in them because they're so incriminating. And they reveal the darkest parts of our human nature and of our history. So if I say in the beginning of the book, if you find a photograph, say of a lynching, for instance, including the ones that are used on postcards, it's incumbent upon you to turn and make it part of that resistance, to research it, to memorialize what happened, figure out what happened, expose the people in the photograph who brought that about. And whether it's in a textbook or in the classroom, or if the people are still alive, to actually work on the case, get the case going, because the photograph is a really powerful piece of evidence, and it's been very successful in convicting Nazi perpetrators as well.
Yeah, there's a really remarkable moment there towards the end of the book when you're quoting Margaret Bork White, the American photojournalist, and be invited by Eisenhower and Marshall as journalists to come to see the newly liberated camps. And you quote her, she says something about like, I couldn't wait to be able to develop this film to be able to be really convinced of what I had just seen there, or something to that effect. It's not exact quote, but something about the way that the photograph itself, like that will affirm the reality, right? She's there, she's actually there at the liberation of Buchenwald, but like it's not until she can see the photo of it that will have some kind of like reality, more power, right? So yeah, the power of the photograph, I think, really comes across in the book. Speaking of power images, Jonathan, you mentioned in your remarks about you might say something about the cover of the book, which had me excited because I was hoping you would. So I'm going to put it up here, and I really love this cover. So this is a photo of the Kassirer family apartment in Berlin, right? And early 20th century, and a red image rectangle here where Pizarro once hung, yeah. And at one point in the book, you allude to the way that paintings in private holdings, especially if they're in somebody's home, become items that people live with, right? There's a sort of sense of kind of connection there. And I guess I would love for you to say more about that element, especially as a way of perhaps returning the victims to the center of this narrative that has all these like art collectors, dealers, looters, etc. Like those are the people at the center of your story, and the people who've been victimized are sort of further in the background. But that's at least a moment where you kind of hint that that these objects are not just objects, but that there's something beyond them or that comes from them in relation to their owners that felt important to me, and I'd love to hear you say more about that.
Right. So thank you, Dorian. So yes, the painting here in the cover is the Camille Pissarro cityscape that was taken from the Kassirer family in 1939. The member of the family that had it, Lily Kassirer, she was able to get out of Germany in March of 39, but not without relinquishing this picture. And she had photos of their apartment in Berlin with a picture. And Pissarro, I should say, was such an important painter too, as a Jewish French impressionist, and he was frequently collected by European Jews. Same with Egon Schiele, who was not Jewish, but almost all his collectors were Jewish, and most of them perished in the Holocaust. And so with both Pissarros and Schieles, there's an inordinate number of looted pictures that are still out there. And we always have to look at them very, very carefully. And Dorian, your point is, art is an unusual kind of asset, if you will, or property, because first of all, it's such a creative object, right? And, the artist put so much time into it, and it has certain qualities. But typically, these artworks are retained by families. They're oftentimes passed down from generation to generation. People live proximate to them, and so they have real meaning. As you mentioned in the introduction, my scholarship has had practical application, and I worked on litigation, and I worked for this Presidential Commission on Holocaust Assets. And my bosses on the Presidential Commission, they wanted to kind of finish up all the, to do all the unfinished business of World War II with regard to Holocaust victims' assets. But they realized that art defied a global solution. You couldn't restitute all the pictures at one time. You couldn't resolve it. And so art is, looted art has stayed with us, and it will stay with me for the rest of my career. There was a question in the chat about how many Nazi looted artworks are out there, and we don't really know, especially because of what happened in Eastern Europe. There's a lot of folk art in Eastern Europe, things that are not museum quality, that don't have provenance, a written history, and art historians haven't studied. It's simpler things. But I'm struck by the story of the Israeli novelist Aaron Appelfeld. He went back to his hometown in Bukovina, which was once Ukraine, now Romania. He went into the town and asked them and says, what happened to the Jewish people here? And he said, there were no Jews here. Only one person would let Aaron Appelfeld into his house. He went in, and as he sat there, he looked in the wall and he saw pictures and he saw books, and he said, these are from the Jewish community. They're still here. This could have been from my family. And he started to imagine these were his family's possessions. And that's one of the things we have in Eastern Europe. There's tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of objects that have never been restituted, and they're in the homes now of Christian Europeans, Christian Poles, and Christian Ukrainians taken from the Jewish population, right? So there is so much unfinished business to be done. And I think because of the poignance of these artworks, because of its importance to families, they still want the artworks today. We just have to continue with this work going into the future.
I'm so glad you were mentioning that and stressing the power of these objects as far as their meaning to the victims. And so much in the New York Times and a lot of the headlines are about the big famous artworks, and they're auctioning off and the monetary value, and it gives the impression that it's all about the money, when with this, especially the Western Jewish communities that assimilated and wanted to become part of European culture and apply with their wealth, that they purchased these items. Sometimes these were up and coming artists or artists who weren't very popular either, but they became part of that world of collecting and of supporting and being benefactors to these artists. And it was part of their becoming part of Europe and be Europeanizing in a way. So, it's just also the way that was kind of stripped away from them too, was also an act of dehumanization and very personal. So I thank you for talking about that, because I don't think it's stressed enough. I think there's a cynicism that also surrounds this conversation about restitution.
Yeah. I mean, there were times reading, especially Jonathan's book, where I was kind of just like, ugh, I had a real 99% reaction, like this sort of this elite kind of wealth, the money, the figures, etc., that these artworks are being sold for, etc., and I really felt like these other things were, like that are being ignored. So it's so lovely to hear both of you kind of talk about that other element. So I'm going to read a question from Marianne, who happens to be my wife, and so I know that she is smarter than I am, and so asking excellent questions. So I'm excited. It's good to have a ringer. It's striking to consider the photos from Ukraine alongside the Matisse images, both contributing in their own way to our idea of history. If it is incumbent upon us to recognize the photos as object of resistance, even if they were not intended as such, what are our historical responsibilities vis-a-vis the artworks that were looted and trafficked when we display and view them? Is it incumbent upon us to contextualize them and their histories in the same way we might photograph? What are the implications of their history for our aesthetic experience of them? Yeah, so when and I really was thinking about, like, in both books, like when I teach some of these photographs that you're talking about, Wendy, or if I think about museum visits that I've done, Jonathan's really making me wonder, like, in ways I've not before, like, where did these paintings come from? And so, like, what role do we have in these ethical questions that you're both bringing up?
Yeah, that your wife's question is so awesome, because in the atrocity photography debate, it's usually about the aesthetic versus the evidentiary value, but not the social justice, not the pursuit of justice, not, that the materiality of it as part of this history of redress. I don't know, Jonathan?
Yeah, I mean, I think the best practices standards for me would be to give more history of these looted paintings when they are exhibited. And I think we owe that to the victims and their families. And sometimes that happens. Sometimes it happens when museums don't want to restitute an artwork, and their compromise, their settlement is to say, oh, we'll put a label, we'll put a little description next to the painting and tell them about your family's involvement, but we don't actually want to give you the picture back. So I'm not suggesting that as an alternative to restitution. I think we should do both. We should restitute it or find settlements and still have these didactic labels that can explain the history. And I think the audiences want to know this history. I was asked a question the other day about what happens to an artwork in terms of its value when it's been looted and restituted. If it hasn't been restituted, obviously the value is very low because no one wants to touch it if there are still questions, but it's been restituted. Actually, now I think audiences appreciate that, and looted paintings that have been restituted have consistently outperformed or surpassed expectation. When the Klimt painting, The Lady in Gold, was sold to Ronald Lauder in 2006, no one expected a Klimt painting to earn $135 million. But there's something about the story of this picture tied up with this Viennese family, the Bloch-Bauer family. And so people want to know, the stories behind these pictures, and the market reflects that. So I think I'm all for education and contextualization, just not as a substitute for restitution.
So we're almost out of time, and I do want to remind people that you can purchase copies of these books, both from the Six Bridges Literary Festival site and also from Wordsworth Books, our independent bookstore here in Little Rock, Arkansas, a place that is very dear to my heart. So, and they'll send it to you wherever you are. So I encourage you strongly to do that. I guess, although I have lots of other questions, I'm not going to be able to ask them. I'll just ask one last quick thing. Maybe you could each say very briefly, can you give us a glimpse into what each of you are working on now? Are you working on something together, or are you keep those things siloed? Like, what's next?
Professor Lauer?
We're working on a book together, and we're looking at the last few days of Heinrich Himmler and his attempt to at first flee, but even negotiate a separate peace, and his downfall and the kind of de-escalation and the kind of collapse of the terror regime. So much of the literature focuses on his accumulation of power, his escalation in his prominence in the regime. And there's a lot of focus on the bunker and Hitler. But, when Himmler was on the run, at first he had an entourage of over 100 SS officers, and they all kind of peeled off through the Northern Rat Line and, made a break for it. And it's just an interesting study of these tyrants, these terrorist regimes and how they fall apart. So I don't know, Jonathan, did you want to add to that?
I think it's a great description of our project. What happens to tyrants, what goes through the mind of a mass murderer, of the architect of genocide as they're about to be caught. How do wars end? What was the role of the Allied troops in all of this? They took a lot of souvenirs from Himmler and papers and that. Why are there conspiracy theories about that he was murdered? And so we're again focusing on something fairly specific and hoping it will radiate out to some really big questions, as you were talking about earlier.
Right.
And yeah, so we're working together on a project. We finished.
That's really cool. It's also
we're
really
excited. And by the way, we employed a couple of freshman undergraduates to do our research, and learned that this generation, they don't even know the Heinrich Himmler. That name does not ring any bells, doesn't generate any kind of reaction.
Well, hopefully the book will help redress that problem a little bit. Yeah. So our time is up. We have to stop. I would just end by kind of like reminding everyone of the date of the photo that Wendy's book is centered on. That's October 13th, 1941. So it's almost exactly 80 years since that awful day, right? And so you know, we see here like just one more way in which that past moment is not past, that it kind of continues to resonate on into the present. Both of your works kind of help us kind of to deal with that ongoing past. So I really thank you. If we were in person, you could hear the thunderous applause. You're just going to have to imagine it here. But thanks to you, thanks to our audience. Don't forget to buy these books at your local independent. Thanks so much.
Thank you, Dorian. It was fabulous to be with you.
Yeah,
Great
thanks both of
moderator.
you. Take care.